In the spring of 1897, in a town that no longer exists by the same name, a family prepared to leave everything behind. They had purchased tickets, they had packed their belongings, they had said their goodbyes. But on the morning they were meant to board the train west, only the luggage arrived at the station. The family, all 5 of them, had vanished. The town was called Grayford, a coal mining settlement in western Pennsylvania, tucked between low ridges and the slow-moving waters of the Allegheny. It was not a place people came to. It was a place people left when they could afford to, and the Farrow family could finally afford to. Thomas Farrow was 42 years old, a mine foreman with calloused hands and a cough that had worsened every winter for the past decade. His wife, Margaret, was 38, a school teacher before marriage, now a mother whose face had aged faster than her years. Their children were Eleanor, 16, Samuel, 13, and little Ada, only 7. They lived in a narrow wooden house on Crescent Street, painted white once, now gray with soot. The windows faced the mine entrance across the valley. Every morning, Margaret would watch the men descend into the earth. Every evening, she would count them as they emerged. For 19 years, Thomas had been one of those men. But in February of 1897, Thomas received a letter from his brother in Oregon, an offer of land, work in timber, clean air, a future. Margaret wept when she read it, not from sadness, from relief. They began planning immediately. Thomas sold what little they owned. Margaret wrote to the school board, resigning her volunteer position. The children were told they would see mountains that touched the sky, rivers so clear you could see the stones beneath. Eleanor helped her mother sew new dresses from old fabric. Samuel carved a wooden horse for Ada, something to hold during the long journey. Ada practiced writing her name in cursive over and over because her mother said she would need it for her new school. The neighbors on Crescent Street knew the Farrows were leaving. There had been a small gathering 3 nights before their departure, nothing formal, just tea and bread in the Hendersons' parlor. Margaret had smiled more that evening than anyone had seen in years. Thomas shook hands with men he'd worked beside for 2 decades. Eleanor blushed when John Mercer, the blacksmith's son, asked if he could write to her. Everything was ready. The train was scheduled to depart Grayford Station at 9:15 on the morning of April 14, 1897. On April 13th, the Farrows were seen going about their final preparations. Thomas returned his mining lamp to the company office. Margaret paid the last of their debts at the general store, $3.40, recorded in the ledger. Samuel was seen carrying a trunk to the depot with his father that afternoon. Eleanor bought ribbon at the dry goods shop, pale blue for Ada's hair. That evening neighbors reported seeing lamplight in the Farrow house until well past midnight. This was not unusual. Packing, they assumed. Last-minute details. But when dawn came on April 14th, no one saw the Farrows leave their home. At 8:30, a wagon arrived at Crescent Street to collect their luggage. The driver, a man named Dutch Keller, knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, then tried the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the house was quiet. The trunks and cases were stacked neatly by the door, labeled and ready. The kitchen table was set for breakfast. 5 plates, 5 cups, 5 forks and knives. The stove was cold. The bread was still in the tin, uneaten. But there was no one there. Dutch called out. He walked through every room. The beds were made. Clothes hung in the wardrobe. A pair of Ada's small shoes sat beside the door, laces tied. He loaded the luggage onto his wagon and drove to the station, confused but assuming the family had left early, perhaps on foot, eager to be on their way. But at Grayford Station, there was no sign of the Farrows. 9:15 came and went. The train departed westward, carrying their belongings, but not them. By noon, people began to ask questions. By evening, a search was organized. And in the weeks that followed, investigators from the county seat combed through that small white house on Crescent Street, looking for answers. What they found instead were inconsistencies, small things, strange things. The back door, which Margaret always kept latched, was found slightly ajar. In the cellar, a lantern was still burning, though no one could say why anyone would have gone down there in the night. And in the margins of Margaret's Bible, on the page marked for April 13th, Someone had written a single sentence in pencil, in handwriting that matched hers. "We are not alone in this house." Life had been before that final night. Thomas Farrow arrived in Greyford in 1878, 19 years old, searching for work. The mine was expanding then, and men were needed. He was strong, quiet, reliable. Within 5 years, he was a shift foreman. Within 10, he had married Margaret Cole, the daughter of a Baptist minister from 2 towns over. Margaret had been educated, a rarity for women in that region at that time. She could read Latin, recite poetry, play the piano, but when she married Thomas, she left that world behind. Greyford had no use for Latin. It barely had use for English. Their first child, Eleanor, was born in 1881. Samuel followed 2 years later. Ada came in 1890, unexpected, a late blessing Margaret called her. They were, by all accounts, an unremarkable family. They attended church. They paid their debts. They did not drink, gamble, or cause trouble. But beneath that surface, there were cracks. Thomas's cough had grown worse each year. By 1896, he was bringing up black phlegm every morning. The mine doctor told him it was nothing serious, but Margaret knew better. She had seen too many miners' wives become widows before 40. Eleanor, their eldest, had grown restless. She read books borrowed from the church library, novels about cities, about women who wore fine dresses and attended universities. She had asked her father more than once if she might go to Pittsburgh, find work as a clerk or a secretary. Thomas had refused. Greyford was not a place that encouraged ambition in young women. Samuel was different, quieter. He spent hours alone in the woods behind their house, carving figures from soft pine, animals, faces, things he saw in dreams. Margaret worried about him. He was too much inside his own head, she told Thomas, too separate from the world. And Ada, sweet, small Ada, had begun waking in the night, crying about voices she heard in the walls. Margaret dismissed it as a child's imagination. Thomas said nothing, but he had noticed it too, the way the house seemed to settle differently after dark, the way floorboards creaked in empty rooms. In the months before their planned departure, the family had grown closer, bound together by the shared dream of leaving. But there had also been tension. Eleanor had argued with her mother in late March. A neighbor, Mrs. Hadley, had overheard raised voices through the thin walls. Eleanor wanted to stay in Greyford 1 more year, to marry John Mercer, the blacksmith's son. Margaret had been furious. "You will not throw your life away on this place," she had said. Samuel had asked his father in early April whether they were running from something. Thomas had looked at him strangely and said, "Why would you ask that?" Samuel didn't answer, and Ada had stopped sleeping in her own bed. Every night, for 2 weeks before they vanished, she climbed into her parents' room and slept on the floor beside them. When Margaret asked why, Ada said only, "The man in the hall doesn't like me." Margaret had searched the house. There was no man, but Ada insisted. The house on Crescent Street had been built in 1873 by a mine supervisor named Horace Llewellyn. He had lived there for 3 years before moving east. The Farrows had purchased it in 1883, shortly after Samuel was born. It was not a large house. 4 rooms downstairs, 2 small bedrooms upstairs, a cellar for storage. The walls were thin. The roof leaked in heavy rain, but it was theirs, or so they believed. In the winter of 1896, Thomas had mentioned to a co-worker that he sometimes heard footsteps above him when he was in the cellar. Slow, deliberate steps, as though someone were pacing. The co-worker had laughed. "It's your wife," he said. But Thomas had been in the cellar at times when Margaret was at church, when the children were at school, when the house should have been empty. He never mentioned it again. Margaret, for her part, had confided in her sister-in-law during a visit in January. She said the house felt different at night, colder, heavier. She said she had found doors open that she knew she had closed. She said she once woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of a woman's voice singing softly somewhere in the walls, a lullaby she did not recognize. Her sister-in-law suggested she was overtired. Margaret agreed, but she did not believe it. In the final week before their departure, The Farrows had begun giving away what they could not take with them. Margaret donated books to the church. Thomas gave his tools to younger miners. Eleanor passed her dresses to girls she had known since childhood. On April 11th, 2 days before they vanished, Margaret had tea with her neighbor, Mrs. Cora Henderson. She seemed lighter, Mrs. Henderson later told investigators, happier, but also distracted. At one point, Margaret had paused mid-sentence and stared at the wall behind Mrs. Henderson as though she had seen something there. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Henderson had asked. Margaret blinked, smiled. "Yes, I'm sorry. I thought I saw someone standing there." There was no one. That same day, Thomas stopped by the mine office to return his equipment. The clerk, a man named Albert Finch, remembered the conversation clearly. Thomas had stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back toward the mine entrance. Then he said, almost to himself, 19 years, and I still don't know what's down there. Finch thought he meant coal. Later, he wasn't sure. On the night of April 12th, their final full night in the house, neighbors reported nothing unusual. Lamplight, voices, the ordinary sounds of a family preparing to leave. But in the morning, when Dutch Keller arrived with his wagon, the house was silent, and the Farrows were gone, not fled, not abducted, not dead, at least not in any way that left evidence, simply absent. As though they had stepped out of the world between dusk and dawn, and the world had closed behind them like water over stone. What happened in the house on Crescent Street during the night of April 13, 1897, can only be reconstructed from fragments. There were no witnesses, no confessions, no bodies, but there were traces. Small, strange, insufficient, and from these, a shape begins to emerge. The last confirmed sighting of the Farrow family was at approximately 6:40 in the evening. Thomas and Samuel had been seen returning from the depot where they had delivered the final trunk. A neighbor, Mr. Eugene Marsh, waved to them from his porch. Thomas waved back. Samuel did not look up. At 7 o'clock, lamplight appeared in the kitchen window of the Farrow house. At 7:30, Eleanor was seen briefly at the upstairs window brushing her hair. A girl from 2 houses down, Emily Watts, remembered this clearly because Eleanor had smiled at her. A small, sad smile. It was the last time anyone saw Eleanor Farrow alive. Dinner time in the Farrow household was usually around 8 o'clock. The table had been set. This much is certain, because it was found that way the following morning. 5 plates, 5 cups, forks and knives aligned with the precision Margaret always insisted upon. But the food was never served. The bread remained in the tin, uncut. The stove was cold to the touch when Dutch Keller entered the house the next morning. There was no ash, no residual heat. It had not been lit that evening. This was the first inconsistency. Margaret Farrow was a meticulous woman. If she set a table, she served a meal. If she lit a stove, she cooked. But on the night of April 13th, something interrupted her routine. Investigators later estimated that the family was still in the house as late as 9 o'clock, possibly later. This estimate was based on statements from 2 sources. The first was Mrs. Cora Henderson, who lived next door. She told the county sheriff that she heard voices from the Farrow house around 9:15, not loud, but distinct. A man's voice, a woman's. She could not make out words, but the tone was urgent. Not angry, urgent. The second source was a rail worker named Peter Dwyer, who had been walking home from the depot at approximately 9:30. He passed Crescent Street and noticed that the Farrow house was still lit, not just one lamp but several, upstairs and down. He remembered thinking it odd, given how late it was, but assumed they were finishing their packing. He also remembered something else. The front door was open, not wide, just a few inches, enough to see a sliver of the hallway inside. He did not stop. He did not knock. He simply continued home. Years later, Peter Dwyer would say that he wished he had. Sometime between 9:30 and midnight, the lamps were extinguished. No one saw it happen. But neighbors agreed that by midnight, the house was dark and silent, completely silent. Mrs. Henderson, who often suffered from insomnia, said she heard nothing from the Farrow house after 10 o'clock. No footsteps, no voices, no doors closing. It was as if the house had been emptied, she told investigators, as if no one had ever been there at all. When Dutch Keller arrived the following morning at 8:30, he found the door unlocked. He pushed it open and called out. No response. The hallway was dim. The air smelled faintly of lamp oil and something else, something he couldn't name. Later, he described it as the smell of a room that's been closed up too long. The kitchen was exactly as investigators would later document it. Table set, stove cold, bread uneaten. But there was something Keller noticed that he did not mention until weeks later, during his third round of questioning. The chairs. 4 of the 5 chairs at the kitchen table had been pulled out slightly, as though people had been sitting in them and had stood up quickly. The 5th chair, the smallest one, Ada's chair, was overturned. Keller moved through the house slowly, calling out, feeling increasingly uneasy. In the front room, everything appeared normal. The furniture was in place. The curtains were drawn, but the clock on the mantel had stopped at 10:47. Keller wound it. It started again without issue. There was no mechanical failure. It had simply stopped. Upstairs, the 2 bedrooms were pristine. Eleanor's bed was made with the care of someone who expected to return to it. Her brush sat on the dresser. Her clothes hung in the wardrobe. In the boys' room, Samuel slept there, though Ada had been sleeping on the floor of her parents' room. The bed was likewise untouched. Samuel's carved figures lined the windowsill, arranged by size. The smallest was a bird. The largest was a man with no face. The parents' bedroom was the same. Bed made, clothes folded, everything in its place, except for one detail. The window was open, not broken, not forced, simply open, 6 inches, maybe 8. The air outside had been cold that night, near freezing. Margaret would never have left a window open, and yet, Keller checked the sill. No marks, no disturbance. The window had been opened from the inside. The cellar was the last place Keller checked. He descended the narrow wooden stairs with caution, unsure what he might find. The space was small, dirt-floored, used primarily for storage. Jars of preserves, old furniture, a few crates, and in the center of the room, on the ground, still burning, was a lantern. The flame was low but steady. It had been burning for hours, all night perhaps. Keller extinguished it. He stood there in the darkness for a long moment, listening. The house above him was silent, but in that silence he felt something he could not explain. A presence, not hostile, not malevolent, just there, watching, waiting. By noon on April 14th, the sheriff had been notified. By evening, a search party had combed the surrounding woods, the roads, the riverbanks. No footprints, no signs of struggle, no abandoned clothing. The Farrows had not fled on foot. They had not taken a wagon. They had not boarded a train. They had simply ceased to be findable. On April 16th, investigators returned to the house to conduct a more thorough examination. That was when they found Margaret's Bible. It sat on the small table beside her bed, opened to the Book of Psalms. The page was marked with a ribbon, and in the margin, written in pencil in Margaret's precise hand, was a single sentence: "We are not alone in this house." Beneath it, in different handwriting, shakier, smaller, was a second line: "It's in the cellar." The second line was written in Eleanor's hand. Investigators searched the cellar again. They found nothing, no hidden rooms, no concealed doors, no bones, no bodies, no blood. Just dirt, jars, silence. And yet, 3 of the 4 men who went down into that cellar reported the same sensation, the feeling of being watched by something that had no eyes. One of them, Deputy James Kearney, refused to go back down. When pressed, he said only, "There's something wrong with that space. I don't know what, but it doesn't want us there." On April 22nd, 8 days after the disappearance, a boy named Timothy Rudd was playing near the woods behind Crescent Street. He found something half buried in the mud near the creek bed. A ribbon, pale blue. The same ribbon Eleanor had purchased for Ada's hair on April 13th. It was torn, muddied, but unmistakable. The sheriff organized another search, focusing on the area around the creek. They found nothing else. But the ribbon was evidence. Evidence of movement, evidence of presence, evidence that at least one of the pharaohs had been outside the house. The question was, willingly or otherwise. On the night of April 30th, more than 2 weeks after the family vanished, Mrs. Cora Henderson woke at 3 in the morning to a sound she could not identify, a low hum, rhythmic, almost mechanical. It was coming from the pharaoh house. She went to her window and looked out. The house was dark, empty. The door had been locked by the sheriff days before, but from somewhere inside, deep inside, she thought perhaps the cellar, came that sound. A hum, a vibration, a voice that was not quite a voice. She watched for 10 minutes, then the sound stopped, and the house was silent again. She never told anyone, not until 37 years later, when a researcher tracking the case interviewed her in a nursing home outside Pittsburgh. By then she was 81 years old, and she still refused to walk past that house, even though it had been torn down in 1909. Whatever was there, she said, is still there. The disappearance of the Pharaoh family did not remain a quiet tragedy. Within days, it became a sensation. Newspapers from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia ran front-page stories. Family of 5 vanishes without trace. The Grayford mystery. Did they run, or were they taken? Theories multiplied faster than facts. Some believed Thomas had murdered his family and fled. Others claimed Margaret had orchestrated their escape to avoid debts no one knew existed. A few whispered that the family had been killed by drifters, their bodies hidden in the mines. But none of these theories held under scrutiny. Thomas Pharaoh had no motive to kill his family. Margaret had no debts, and the mines were searched, twice, by men who knew every shaft, every tunnel, every dead end. There were no bodies. There was no blood. There was only absence. The county sheriff, a man named Leonard Briggs, conducted the investigation with methodical precision. He interviewed over 40 people. He examined the house 3 separate times. He reviewed train records, bank statements, mail logs, and employment files. Every lead dissolved into nothing. On May 12th, nearly a month after the disappearance, Sheriff Briggs released a public statement. At this time, we have no evidence of foul play. We have no evidence of voluntary departure. The investigation remains open, but we have exhausted all immediate avenues of inquiry. Anyone with information is urged to come forward. No one did. But privately, Sheriff Briggs confided in his deputy, James Kearney, that he believed something had happened inside that house. Something they did not have the language or the framework to understand. I've worked 23 years in law enforcement, Briggs said. I've seen murders. I've seen suicides. I've seen families torn apart by every kind of cruelty, but I've never seen anything like this. It's as if they were erased. Kearney, who had refused to return to the cellar, simply nodded. He knew. In the months that followed, strange reports began to surface. Small, disconnected, often dismissed as hysteria or imagination. In June of 1897, a miner named Owen Talbot claimed he heard a child's voice while working a deep shaft beneath Grayford. The voice was singing a lullaby. He reported it to his foreman, who told him he was hearing echoes from the surface. But Owen insisted. The voice was close, clear, and it was coming from behind the rock. No one believed him. 2 weeks later, Owen quit the mine and moved to Ohio. In August, a woman named Iris Coughlin reported seeing a figure standing in the window of the abandoned Pharaoh house. A girl, she said, with long dark hair, wearing a white dress. When the sheriff investigated, the house was empty. The windows were locked from the inside. Iris never retracted her statement, but she also never spoke of it again. And in September, a traveling peddler passing through Grayford asked a shopkeeper if anyone had died recently in the White House on Crescent Street. "Why do you ask?" the shopkeeper said. "Because I slept in my wagon near there last night," the peddler replied. "And I swear I heard voices, a whole family, talking in low tones. It sounded like they were saying goodbye." The shopkeeper told him the house had been empty for months. The peddler left town that same day. By the winter of 1897, the Pharaoh case had grown cold. The house remained locked and vacant. Neighbors avoided walking past it after dark. Children dared each other to touch the door but never did. The town, for the most part, moved on. But there were a few who could not. John Mercer, the blacksmith's son who had asked Eleanor if he could write to her, fell into a deep depression. He left Grayford in early 1898 and never returned. According to family letters, he died in 1923, never having married. Thomas Farrow's brother in Oregon, the one who had offered them land and a future, sent multiple letters to the sheriff's office, desperate for answers. He received none. In his final letter, dated March 1899, he wrote, "I will carry the guilt of their loss for the rest of my life. I called them West. I gave them hope. And now they are gone, and I do not even have graves to visit." He stopped writing after that, and Margaret's sister, who had dismissed her fears as exhaustion, told a priest in 1901 that she dreamed of Margaret every night, standing in a dark hallway, trying to speak, but no sound coming out. "She's trying to tell me something," the sister said, "but I can't hear her." In 1903, 6 years after the disappearance, a coal seam collapsed in the mine beneath Grayford. 3 men were killed instantly. 2 others were trapped for 16 hours before being rescued. One of the survivors, a man named Carl Hensley, claimed that while he was pinned in the darkness, he heard footsteps approaching. "I thought it was the rescue crew," he told a reporter, "but the steps were too light, too slow, and then I heard a voice, a man's voice. It said, 'We're still here.'" Hensley was dismissed as delirious from lack of oxygen, but he never worked in the mines again. In 1909, 12 years after the Farrows vanished, the house on Crescent Street was demolished. The town had grown. The mine was expanding. New housing was needed. A crew of 6 men tore the structure down over the course of 3 days. On the second day, while clearing the cellar, they found something that had been missed during the original investigation: a trap door. It was hidden beneath 2 inches of packed dirt in the far corner, barely distinguishable from the floor around it. The wood was old, warped, but intact. The foreman, a man named Stuart Finch, pried it open. Beneath it was a narrow crawl space, no more than 4 feet deep, 8 feet long. It was empty, but the walls of the space were covered in scratches, deep, frantic scratches as though made by fingernails. And in the dirt at the bottom, pressed into the earth, was a single handprint, small, a child's hand. Stuart Finch reported the discovery to the sheriff's office. By then, Leonard Briggs had retired. The new sheriff, a younger man named William Dorn, examined the crawlspace himself. He found the scratches. He saw the handprint, but he also found something else. Carved into the wooden frame of the trapdoor, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, were 4 words. "They made us go." The handwriting was uneven, hurried, but unmistakable. It matched samples taken from Samuel Farrow's school notebooks. Sheriff Dorn reopened the investigation. He interviewed the demolition crew. He re-examined the original case files. He searched the records for any mention of a trapdoor or crawlspace. There was none. The original investigators had not found it, or if they had not documented it. Dorn's final report, filed in January 1910, concluded, "It is the belief of this office that the Farrow family may have been confined to a concealed space beneath their home prior to their disappearance. The identity of those responsible and the ultimate fate of the family remain unknown. Due to the passage of time and the lack of physical evidence, this case is now classified as inactive. Inactive, not closed, just waiting." Over the following decades, the story of the Farrow family became a local legend. Some said they were taken by a cult. Others believed they had discovered something beneath their house, something old, something that predated the town itself. A few claimed the family had never existed at all, that the entire story was an elaborate hoax. But the records remained: birth certificates, marriage licenses, school enrollment, employment logs, photographs. The Farrows had existed. And then, one night in April of 1897, they had not. In 1934, 37 years after the disappearance, a historian named Dr. Raymond Coulter traveled to Grayford to research the case. He interviewed the few surviving witnesses, Mrs. Henderson, Dutch Keller, Peter Dwyer. He examined the case files, the photographs, the evidence logs, and he made one final discovery. In the county archives, buried in a box of unsorted documents, he found a letter. It had been written on April 13th, 1897, the day of the disappearance, and mailed from Grayford that same afternoon. It was addressed to Margaret Farrow's sister in Harrisburg, but it had never been delivered. The envelope was marked, "Return to sender. Addressee deceased. Dr." Coulter opened the letter. Inside, in Margaret's handwriting, were 9 sentences. "We are leaving tomorrow. I should be happy, but I am afraid. Thomas says I am imagining things, but I know I am not. Something is in this house. It has been here for months, maybe longer. It watches us. It moves through the rooms when we sleep. Last night I woke to find Ada standing at the foot of our bed, staring at the wall. When I asked her what she was doing, she said, 'The man told me to stand here.' There was no man. The letter ended there, unsigned, unfinished, as if Margaret had been interrupted and never returned. There are cases that remain open not because evidence is lacking, but because the evidence refuses to cohere into truth. The disappearance of the Farrow family is one of them. Over the decades, investigators returned to it again and again, not out of obligation, but out of compulsion, as if the case itself exerted a kind of gravity, pulling people back into its silence. In 1946, a detective named Arthur Gaines reviewed the files as part of a statewide audit of unsolved cases. He spent 3 months reconstructing the timeline, cross-referencing witness statements, searching for inconsistencies. He found none. Everything matched, everything aligned, and yet nothing made sense. In his final memo, Gaines wrote, "This is not a case of murder. It is not a case of abduction. It is not a case of voluntary flight. It is a case of erasure. 5 people existed, and then they did not. The boundary between those 2 states is so thin as to be invisible." He recommended the case remain open indefinitely. It did. By the 1950s, Grayford itself had begun to disappear. The coal had run out. The mine closed in 1951. Families left in waves, chasing work, chasing futures. The town shrank, then withered, then became a name on old maps that no longer corresponded to any living place. Crescent Street, where the Farrow house once stood, was overtaken by brush and saplings. The foundations crumbled. The street itself was erased by time and weather, but the story remained. It passed from generation to generation, not as history, but as warning. Don't go into the woods near the old Farrow place. Don't dig in that ground. Don't listen if you hear voices. Children who had never known Grayford still knew the name Farrow, and they knew to be afraid of it. In 1978, a journalist named Claire Denton attempted to write a definitive account of the case. She spent 2 years researching. She tracked down descendants of witnesses. She obtained copies of every available document. She even traveled to Oregon to interview the surviving children of Thomas Farrow's brother. They had nothing to add. They had spent their entire lives waiting for news that never came. Denton's article was published in a regional history journal in 1980. It was thorough, well-written, respectful, but it had no conclusion, because there was none to give. In the final paragraph, Denton wrote, "We are drawn to mysteries because we believe on some level that all mysteries can be solved, but the Farrow case suggests otherwise. Some disappearances are not puzzles, they are voids, and voids do not give answers. They only take questions." In 1989, a team of paranormal researchers requested permission to investigate the site where the Farrow house once stood. The request was denied by the county, which by then had rezoned the land as protected wetland. But the researchers went anyway. They brought cameras, audio recorders, electromagnetic sensors, the tools of a profession built on the hope that the dead still speak. They spent 2 nights on the site. On the second night, at approximately 10:47 p.m., the same time the clock in the Farrow house had stopped, every piece of electronic equipment they had brought failed simultaneously. Cameras, recorders, lights, all dead. When they returned to their van and checked the equipment, everything functioned normally. One of the researchers, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Moss, later wrote in her field notes, "I have investigated over 200 sites in my career. I have never felt what I felt in that place. It was not malevolence. It was not sorrow. It was something older than both. It was refusal. They never returned." The last surviving person with a direct connection to the Faro case died in 1991. Her name was Emily Watts. She had been 9 years old in 1897. The girl who had seen Eleanor brushing her hair in the window on the night of April 13th. She lived to be 103. In her final interview, conducted in a hospice in Scranton, she was asked if she remembered the Faros. She closed her eyes. "I remember Eleanor," she said. She smiled at me. I think she knew. Knew what? The interviewer asked. Emily opened her eyes. That she wouldn't be there in the morning. She died 3 days later. In 2003, a graduate student named Michael Pruitt submitted a thesis on the Faro case as part of his master's program in American folklore. His thesis proposed a radical theory, that the family had not disappeared at all, but had been systematically erased from the historical record by persons unknown for reasons unknown. He cited inconsistencies in census data, irregularities in church records, gaps in employment logs. His thesis was rejected, not because it was poorly argued, but because, in the words of his advisor, it raises more questions than it answers and offers no mechanism by which such an erasure could have been accomplished. Pruitt abandoned the project. Years later, in an interview, he admitted, "I stopped because I started to feel like I was being watched, not by people, by the case itself, like it didn't want to be solved." Today, the land where Grayford once stood is mostly wilderness. A few foundations remain, hidden beneath moss and ivy. A historical marker was erected in 1996, noting the town's existence and its role in the coal industry. It makes no mention of the Faros, but if you search the archives, county records, microfilm newspapers, genealogical databases, you will find them. 5 names, 5 lives. 5 people who bought train tickets west, who packed their belongings, who said their goodbyes, and who vanished on the night before they were supposed to leave. There are some who believe the Faros are still there, not as ghosts, not as spirits, but as echoes, trapped in the moment between staying and leaving, between existence and absence. Some say that if you stand on the site where their house once stood, on the night of April 13th, at exactly 10:47 p.m., you can hear them. Voices in the dark, a family saying goodbye, not to the town but to the world. The case file remains open. It sits in a storage facility outside Pittsburgh in a box labeled Faro, 1897, unresolved. No one has requested it in over a decade. But it waits, because some stories do not end. They do not resolve. They simply continue in the spaces between what is known and what can never be known. The Faros were not taken by violence. They were not lost to accident. They were not fleeing guilt or shame. They were a family who wanted to leave, and in wanting to leave, they discovered something that would not let them go. On April 14, 1897, a train departed Grayford Station at 9:15 a.m., heading west toward a future the Faro family would never see. Their luggage arrived in Oregon 3 weeks later. The trunks were unclaimed. Eventually, they were auctioned. Inside one of them, wrapped in cloth, was a wooden carving, a small bird, unfinished, as if the hands that had been shaping it had simply stopped and never returned. In the end, the only certainty is this: 5 people existed, 5 people prepared to leave, and on the morning they were meant to depart, only their absence remained. Not death, not disappearance, just absence. A void in the shape of a family, and voids once opened are never truly closed. They almost left, and that was the tragedy, because whatever kept them there is still waiting, still watching, still silent, and it has all the time in the world.